My name is Eric Sembrat. I work and live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I work inside this building where this photo is taken at Georgia Tech. And so I do web development there and honestly a whole lot of everything. So if you want to learn more about me, reach out to me afterwards. You can find me at Twitter at @esembrat, pretty straightforward. And of course, if you want to learn more about me, I also have a website where you can look at my previous talks, find out my research interests, and you can find that at webit.com. So let's get started. So let's talk today about web on campuses. So that topic tends to be a rather large encompassing issue and environment to which we live in. So of course, I think we all know that our users for our institutions use the web in unique and varied ways across the campus. So we have students, both undergraduate and graduate, and of course we have faculty staff, and within faculty staff we have all sorts of derivations and different kinds of faculty and staff roles to which they use the website for whatever they need to do on their day-to-day basis. And of course for students, they use them for a lot of things, from things like projects, courses, and initiatives, to personal information, student organizations, research, and a whole lot of other things they could be working on today. So for faculty and staff, we see that faculty and staff roles are using more of the web on their campuses for more of the work that they're doing, for broadcasting news and events, for setting up organization and groups between colleagues, as well as just for general management of their units and departments, and for managing a lot of their workflow for their business processes. So what we found is, traditionally and historically, we've seen that homegrown and custom web development simply doesn't cut it as you scale up. That ends up to require more staffing and just be something that as we have more and more folks consuming the web, we're having to build out more and more customization and flexibility that a custom solution that we build in-house can't simply meet. And so we need help with that. For a lot of our institutions, we're having more and more work to do with either the same or less amount of resources that we currently have. And so we turn to things like systems, frameworks, and platforms to help ease that burden of having the additional overhead and requirements, but the same or less amount of staffing. We commonly get stuck innovating and sticking with one system as we become comfortable with it and start to use it for all the different uses. Of course, change is hard, variety is expensive, but is going with one system or one platform necessarily bad? And here's where I argue, of course it is. Ignoring other and better tools for a website or web application makes your jobs more complex and fragile. Though some systems, like WordPress, are used for a lot of great things, there are also some things to which WordPress does not do as well as other custom-made applications that may be finely tuned for that. So let's consider a quick synopsis. So, in the scenario of a campus or an institution which has adopted Drupal as a primary content management system, which is a competitor to WordPress, and you want to offer a website service solution, that is a service to where people can request and build websites at the snap of your fingers. So when looking at the general layout of how this is organized from staffing and requirements, for those who have worked with WordPress multi-site, and which they call, of course, multi-user, you'll find that the setup, maintenance, and new features are pretty straightforward. WordPress, thankfully for this scenario, works upon the concept of plug-and-play plugins, where plugins do one thing very, very well. So you'll see that the hours are fairly small there, and honestly not that painful. Of course, there is going to be some custom development you may have to do, but it's not as much as Drupal multi-site, which if you've ever worked with Drupal, building things for general usage for an institution can require a lot of hours of setup, a lot of hours of maintenance, and a questionable amount of work for new features, just because Drupal is very component-based. So rather than building, for example, a photo gallery, you're building out bits and pieces to build out a photo gallery. So a photo content type and a view or a page to which displays a set of photos. So rather than doing it all in one place, you're sort of building out that component-wise and then putting it together just like you would Lego pieces, which can work very well or work very badly. So which would you choose? If you had the same amount of staffing that you currently do and you had to add this to your resources and to your work day, what would you choose? And instead of thinking about WordPress and Drupal and all these different services fighting for your attention or for your expertise, we should think about it instead as loving all the services equally and picking and choosing and learning them based on what their pros and cons are. And that's basically what a web ecosystem is. It's taking advantage of what exists out in the world in terms of what systems and platforms exist for what we're doing already, as well as sort of the custom-made applications on the web that exist to do things very well in one way. So of course, would you build a learning management system from the ground up if you already have something for a software application which does it and you don't have the staffing or resources to be able to build that? Something like a pre-built learning management system may seem a lot more comfortable than spending the resources to, for example, rebuild WordPress to be a learning management system. And that just brings a lot of love together. We're using the best of all the worlds that we have together with the staffing that we have to make some great things. Without a guiding hand, your campus is going to segment and silo up. And those websites will rebuild and reuse resources over and over and over again. Of course, that's kind of just what reinventing the wheel is. They're going to go through and redo a theme on different platforms. And because those platforms may not be built with reusability in mind, it's going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up every single time. A web ecosystem then, more broadly and sort of away from more platforms and looking from the ground up, is we're supporting a campus support web team with a support infrastructure underneath, leveraging a combination of both static website assets, your tools and workflow that exist, along with your content repository so that these resources are easily available to be presented to your campus end users. So that as your information and your knowledge flows downwards, the can consume sure that all the resources are available for extending into new and exciting platforms as folks experiment with new technologies, new services, and extend what the campus is doing. And of course, it's a collection of platforms, tools, services, and assets to blend campus web identity across any application. Now, I'm putting an asterisk there because I'm sure there is a case where any is not applicable there. However, this maximizes your potential to blend your campus web identity and bring those standards over to as many applications as possible so that if you want to experiment with, for example, WordPress or a static site generator, you're not having to rebuild your campus theme from the ground up that you've already built for one system or one platform. So when we think about platform, we think about the support infrastructure that exists in place for that. And really this just sort of involves where does your campus offerings for web live physically. And when we think about the physical infrastructure for the web, we think of two things. We think of the cloud, the big, scary, ominous cloud. And if this was a GIF, it would show a mushroom cloud. The cloud, of course, has a lot of promises. Of course, you have to think about the considerations, costs, and privacy there. And then, of course, you have on-site. On-site being on-premises in your institution with the resources and hardware that you have available for it. When considering where your platform should live, and this doesn't mean that all your platforms have to live in the same place, you have to consider things like features. How easy is it to add, extend, remove features to make sure that it meets what your campus needs? Making sure that your security is paramount both for your data and your structure. Making sure that updates are available in a timely manner and that you can apply them, and for what happens when applying updates doesn't work too well. And that's where support comes into place, to make sure that you can actually manage, maintain, and continue to enhance your service and your platform so that the services and web applications that live there can live there harmoniously with what you're looking to build. When we think about tools, and of course, your tools also live under your support infrastructure. The tools answer the question, what helps the web developers on campus do the job of web development? Of course, they provide workflow for code and deployment. Questions like, how do I back up? Do I pull down or push up code? And what scaffolds exist to help my web development services be as easy and as straightforward as possible so I'm not reinventing the wheel? So these come in two primary formats. Primarily, you have things like Sass or Post CSS or less. And these are code helpers. These are preprocessors, variables, reusable code chunks. These are services and tools that exist to help scaffold the tried and true web development that you're already doing. And it's a living, breathing document or a collection of documents that takes the dry approach or the don't repeat yourself approach to code snippets. If you've already written it once, why do you have to write it over and over again if you're doing the same thing with minor changes? These reusable code chunks allow you to, for example, take a theme and reuse it across different platforms with minimal changes so that every time you roll out an update, you don't have to spend a week and a half changing it for all your platforms. This makes it as easy as possible for you to roll out, for example, a WordPress theme update, both to WordPress, but also to your static site generators, or to your LMS system, or to your Drupal websites. Makes it super easy. Your second one's your GitHub, your actual content repository, which allows you to do code sharing, code archival services, and code revisioning and reversioning. This allows you to collaborate across campus and beyond, both inside your institution between members that may be physically present from your office, as well as beyond the institution to look at what your peers are doing and to work along with your peers if you're doing the same thing. If other institutions are using WordPress in a particular way, like let's say for single sign-on, it's a great way to collaborate with those services without us all having to start from the ground up on a shared process that we're already doing. So when we look at services, we think about services as the kinds of tools that we provide. And of course, you'll notice that this is like portfolio tools, blogs and microsites, CRMs, workflows, and then of course your heavy content management systems. This is driven by a tool set of platforms and systems that the campus or the users of the campus support and leverage. And this can kind of be thought of as your campus web dossier. This is your collection of, if you want this kind of project, the best services that we have and the experiences that we have on this campus are to use this or this system based on the success cases of this unit or this group. There's 4 levels of complexity for campus websites, and if you've played with websites enough, you probably already have an inkling of what this is. Of course, you have your static and old websites. We've all seen those that need a fresh coat of paint. Those are your faculty websites from 1990 that still exist, and they still advertise and update here in 2018. Then you have your brochureware level and low-level websites that benefit from the shared assets. Those are people that just want to build a quick and easy website, but also don't want to build a theme or build any plugins. They just want to throw content on there, build a quick blog, build a quick lab website, and call it a day. Then you have your larger, more component or object-based websites that deal with more complicated methods of storing and displaying data. That's things like your college and school websites, where you're having to manage a boatload of audiences, data, resources, options there, and making sure all that data is as reusable and as scalable as possible so you can maintain them as those features and as that content changes. And then, of course, you have the granddaddies of them all, your custom fit applications. These are your fairly large components that do one thing and do it incredibly well. You would never build a repository system out of Drupal or WordPress unless you really had to. Same with the customer relationship management system. If there's something that already exists to do, for example, mass emailings and marketing strategies to end users or to audiences, let's let those applications do what they're meant to do. Same with digital archive management systems. So if we're managing photos and videos, there's a service that does that. You don't want to have to be managing video archival and video streaming upon a content management system if we already have a service that does it incredibly well. So these shared resources and assets between all 4 aspects makes your life as easy as possible, because that reusability allows you to be consistent across all your different platforms and all across the use cases, both for updates and for your user experience and for your usability of your website. There's an expected place where, for example, your menu is going to be on a service and it's consistent across all 4 of those levels. That makes your life, both from the web developer as well as your end users, very, very happy. And that makes reusability really the strong binding glue that helps make this happen. And of course, so like I mentioned earlier, your statical websites, those are going to be your static site generators, your super light content management systems, which have a very narrow presence on your website. For the low-level websites and brochureware level websites that benefit from the shared assets, those are lighter CMSs, blogging platforms, things like WordPress. WordPress, of course, can do more heavy lifting, but out of the box, it works very, very well for folks that just want a website and want it up as soon as possible. You can't do that with Drupal, which is more of a heavy content management system, which is more component or object-based. You can do it, but it requires a lot of overhead and setup for it. And so these are your more cutting-edge web frameworks. These are more of your modern-day web practices that we see outside of higher education that require a lot of technical setup to get going. And then, of course, like I was mentioning, your custom-fit applications really are those digital asset repositories, those customer relationship management tools, really those very heavy lifting services. And you want to share configuration and assets within each type. So of course, all your static and old websites, those very light content management system and static site generators, it's super helpful to have your resources split up between those because they're all doing basically the same thing and keeping on the same level of complexity. It's a fantastic way to go through and be consistent there. And of course, you also want to share throughout the spectrum. So what works for a static site generator, like a theme or a theme configuration, may also work as you scroll down through complexity. So if you're using, for example, a consistent framework or a foundational theme to bring down into each of these, sharing that allows you to have that be reusable all the way down through all the services and web applications that you use, including WordPress. And now to the good stuff. That's your assets. And so as we go through there, your assets are your static website assets. Hidden up in the top left of our use cases over there, those are your reusable components. It's kind of what I've been hinting at the entire time. These are your plug and play elements that make your life as easy as possible. And these take the forms of a couple of things. Ideas like actually making sure your theme and branding is consistent and uniform across your services. Making sure that you have emergency integration so that if your website needs to present, heaven forbid, a emergency notification for your campus, that there's an opening there to have the proper folks on your within your institution or on your campus actually add that and have your website show it. Of course, a major and great thing here is by leveraging these centralized static website assets, you can bake in as much accessibility as possible within your reusable code so that you're doing it once and making sure it scaffolds down to all your different services. Of course, for what we do here on campus, you'll find that a lot of folks in higher ed reuse a lot of content. The primary things of reusability we tend to do are things like news and events and directory information. You know, faculty want their profile and research interests to be the same across as many places as possible. And if you build your web ecosystem to have them do it once and show up on WordPress and show up on their own faculty website and show up on their school and college website all at the same time, makes everyone's life super easy. And then, of course, finally, we have the more subtle parts of campus that you may not think about on a day-to-day basis, but things like logo repositories. If your campus goes through a brand refresh, having those logos and assets be available for modern day usage means that you're reducing the idea of having those older and legacy logos, for example, being reused across your campus. And by having those incorporated within all these other tools, make sure that it's as deliverable and as easy to find and as easy to use as possible. And of course, above all else, the one thing that we in IT always strive for but never seem to work on is documentation. Really saves everyone in a lot of work and a lot of time and helps bring everyone up to understanding how to use these services. Documentation is the binding glue that helps us work with what we have and encourages us to reuse these because we have a workflow, best practices, and written knowledge on how these services, tools, and assets can be best used. And of course, when you think about your documentation, that takes 4 primary forms. It's the how we do it, why we did it, where we did it, and then when we do it. So finding out the best place to the scenarios to which you place these assets in will make your life easy no matter what platform you're working with. And of course, the unspoken element here is your community. Your community is your subject matter experts. They're your consumers, your contributors, and your knowledge makers. They're just not the folks that are creating the web development tools that you're using or being the point of contacts for a specific service, but they're also that first customer that's always the first person to grab on a new service or a new service offering and isn't shy to give you feedback when something's working great or something's not working great. They're also the contributors that work behind the scenes in creating the new assets and resources and experimenting with new services and seeing how they can fit within your institution and where they might meet particular needs or limitations that currently exist on your campus. And sort of as a side effect of this, when you have those community members and your subject matter experts that are doing amazing things on your campus, this gives you a great opportunity to build a community of practice between all the folks that are working on your campus, to build that competency, expertise, and experience for users outside of that team, whether that be your core subject matter experts or within an individual organization or unit. By building a community of practice and encouraging the sharing, distribution, and training of these kinds of resources and expertise, you're extending all that knowledge out so that additional folks and new users can build into that community and bring their own perspectives for expertise and extend what you already have. And so, of course, we have the web staff scaffolding down your assets and platforms tools to those end users. And when we think about what actually that takes the form of, that's your web expertise and researchers at the top doing all the heavy lifting and foundational work that then hand down reusable components and the theme frameworks, driving down to use-based driven web software and best practices based on what we know and what we've experimented with. And then that drops down to a community of practice for building, maintaining, and encouraging growth and expertise. And as you might expect, that community of practice actually ends up extending and drilling back to the very top and working with your web expertise as you build up new experts and new competency subject matter experts in areas from your community that you've established. So the real question here, all this is good and dandy, and all of this is super important to what we do here on campuses because we all have issues that take the form of all the different content management systems, tools, resources, and platforms that we use. We can talk about it all day, but when it comes down to actually making the change, it's almost the most important part of what we're working with. Because it's not just about having these resources and having them there, it's creating an environment so that these resources and changes can happen in an organic and stress-free way. And of course, before I go any further, it's worth noting that if your campus traditionally has a distributed or siloed approach to web infrastructure, that means, for example, if units are in organizations and groups on your campus or within your institution are historically used to doing things themselves as part of their silo or as part of their organization, such as building their own themes and not working with cross collaboration between units, making that change is going to take a lot longer. You have both organizational barriers as well as personnel barriers that you have to overcome. Of course, it's doable. It just takes a little bit longer, and it requires a little bit more work up front. So let's start with the first step, which is really just defining your end goal. By that, I'm meaning you need to look at your present web infrastructure and find out what works and what doesn't work. So take a look at what services you offer, what websites are currently being built, how folks are taking advantage of that as well as what issues are people running into. And of course, there's also something that we don't really think about sometimes because it's almost the hardest question to answer. And it's almost what is missing? What are folks not doing because there's no infrastructure or no historical documentation there to do anything with it? Whether that be missing a platform, or missing resources, or just missing someone to serve as an expert to help guide that off the ground. So when you're thinking about these questions, you need to consider just not your experts and not just your web developers, but also your end users, the faculty, staff, students, and visitors that exist across your institution and beyond that are consuming and visiting your websites. And of course, this also means your stakeholders. If there's any cases where you may have a specific use set or a subset of those folks that are visiting a particular type of website, those folks need to be kept in mind too. And how can those folks in their position be a force for change? Of course, when you think about your end users, those are mostly consumers of websites, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be a force for change. As the consumers of their website, they're your visitors. They're the folks that drive traffic to your website, and they're the folks that consume the website content and organizational structure there. So they serve as a major force for change because they are the folks that are actually going through and using your website. And they're a great resource to look for and to speak for what kinds of things would make their life as the end users of the products you create as easy as possible. And one thing to note is when you're thinking about what works and what doesn't work, as well as formulating an end goal for your attempt to bring consistency and an ecosystem to your campus, you need to make sure you advertise it. You need to showcase what benefits this provides to your current infrastructure, as well as pointing out what limitations currently exist on your campus and how making an environment for collaboration and reusability makes your life a lot easier. Not just for WordPress. So of course, collaborating and building themes for WordPress works super well. And advertising that's a great benefit, but it's not just WordPress. It's all the other content management systems. It's all the custom applications that a unit or an organization on your campus has bought for a specific use case, where the reusability of those WordPress assets across all those services makes your life and everyone else's a lot simpler and makes our work easier at the end of the day. So number 2 is, of course, getting your campus buy-in and input. You're reaching out to your web users and web developers on campus, and you're asking them those same 3 questions. Reaching out to those users, what you're really trying to find out is the same kind of things. What doesn't work, what works, and what's missing. And because you're reaching out to specific units and specific organizations, you'll find that this will be a bit more targeted and a bit more consequential to finding things that you may not have found on your first step of analysis. And of course, if you're decentralized, this is the point where you would start finding partners, support, or buy-in from central units or additional units on campus. You're looking to build partnerships to help steer your climate away from a decentralized or siloed approach, to build out those relationships between units, to build up collaboration and reusability to show as a proof of concept for how things can be amazing and how you can do things with other units so you're not reinventing the wheel. And it's really playing the politics game. If you don't like to do it, there are nicer ways of going around it. But of course, if you want to shout out the benefits, you have the ability to do so here. Number 3 is to start out something small. This is a proof of concept. You're finding the potential fix and making the change. So like I was saying, it's really a point to show where the proof is a proof of concept and showing where things can be made easier on your campus. If your campus is decentralized, this should be easy. Those issues and those proof of concepts and those cases exist everywhere. If you're centralized, it's worth looking at what resources you're working with today and seeing what advantages and what changes you can make to bring change across your campus. And the way that I like to think about this is, because it's a proof of concept, you want to be focused on an easy win. You want to look for a project that's not going to require meetings every day or a substantial amount of resources, either financially or staffing. You want to be able to find a project at a smaller scale and go through your project phases to test a solution. And where do you find these issues? It's typically great to ask your web developers, ask your users, ask a central web group if you have one, and even look inside and ask yourself what might be missing that you, as an end user, can find value in. And number 4 is, of course, the most fun one, and this is pushing for change or making that change. So the best way to make change across your campus is, of course, to start with yourself. is begin by being the change you want to see. As children, a lot of us probably heard a similar phase in terms of treating folks like how we want to be treated. You want to do the same thing with how you actually want to build your web development on campus and your ecosystem so that you're saving yourself from having to reinvent the wheel over and over again. You're going to want to get buy-in or get outreach to leadership, developers, and end users, and work, and there's the first part, and work to bring change across your campus. And of course, like I was saying earlier, that's also playing the politics game. And this is also an aspect of community building. So it takes in both reaching out to folks that may be in more higher or executive levels in management, as well as reaching to your colleagues and your end users and the folks that are part of your community that exist, even if your community is fractured or somewhat ambiguous. And then, of course, forward planning. This is probably the most important part of a web ecosystem, is that you can't predict the future. You can plan for change and you can plan for growth. And those two things are just as important as predicting the future, because what you're doing is you're planning for that eventual change, because we all know that technology eventually goes out of date. It eventually deprecates. There's eventually a solution that is better or more recent or more cutting edge. And so we get to plan for those changes so that when they come up, we can know what to expect as well as know how to make that change. So I always like to consider the major change that we've seen, not in WordPress, because WordPress has always handled migration between major versions in an elegant way, but things like Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So for those who don't know what Drupal is our another content management system similar to WordPress. Drupal 7 is more like WordPress as it exists today. Drupal 8 has adopted a lot of PHP frameworks like Symfony and Twig in order to boost reusability and to build in some more object-oriented programming within a web language. And so that change requires a lot of infrastructure and a lot of resources to make it happen. But for folks and web units and institutions that have been planning for it, the change to Symfony and Twig aren't as much of a culture shock to units that are already experimenting with Symfony and Twig, because those concepts aren't new to a content management system. We have services and web applications that have been using that for the last 5-7 years or so. And it's only just now that you're starting to see the trickle down of that new technology and new way of thinking for web development into our larger, more behemoth content management systems. So planning the ecosystem isn't about just today. It's about making sure that what you're doing is both looking at what you're doing today and looking forward. And as someone noted in the comments, yes, Gutenberg is a great example of that. We all know it's coming, we know it's there, and we have a good foundational point to start preparing for it, because we have code out there. We have examples of folks leveraging that for taking advantage of, for example, building out blocks on individual pages. We're working to make sure accessibility is maintained there. It's a super great way of thinking ahead and making sure that when these major things like Gutenberg comes around and becomes a standard, that we can work with it, not around it. And so with that, I'm at 34 after, and I'm going to open up the floor to questions. I also saw a question in chat about showing the dogs. So in true form, I'm going to bring up my microphone or my camera real quick and showcase the little monsters if I can pry them away from their bones. Otherwise, I'll leave the microphone open and we'll go for questions. You little loud. Oh, I know. It's time to be superstars. So this is Hubble, and the very hungry dog over here that's a little monster that also wants to go eat is Ziggy. So these are my two little rambunctious puppies. All right, you're done. Thank you. And they've done all that they can do for this. And so with that, I'm going to leave my slides open. Anyone that has any questions, I am here until 11:45. I will toggle my mic. It looks like we have one question in the chat. Oh, and look, it's from my favorite person, Rachel, and she's asking something very technical. And so Rachel, yes, I do see a start answering button, and I pressed it, and what it does is it shows the done answering button, which it looks like it allows me to basically answer via audio. And then I think that's just what it did. So it looks like it may record that. So for questions that I can answer with my voice, I will try that, and it sounds like that may do that. And then what I'll do is I'll also comment it by typing just to make sure. I'm going to swing back real quick for the contact information. Of course, that's the most important at the end of a presentation. If you want to reach out to me if you have any questions, usually the best method to do so is going to be my website, just because that will link to my email, to Twitter, to all that good stuff. I welcome you if you have any questions afterwards. What you can do here is reach out to me. Go to my website. You can send me an email, tweet at me, find me on your social media platform of choice, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have there. So for the next 7 minutes or so, I'll be idling here if you have any questions. At that point, I will officially close out the session, and we'll begin setting up for our next schedule. I just want to thank you all for being here today. It's been very amazing to have y'all in the virtual room, and I hope you have a great time at the rest of WP Campus for today. Thank you very much. All right, so we have a question that popped in via the questions and answers dialogue that appears underneath the video here in Crowdcast. The question is, who do you view as your primary audience? The people managing the sites or the people visiting the sites? Have you ever had to choose between the two, and how do you approach that? So when I think about the primary audience, it really depends on the scenario to which I'm looking at. If I'm looking at the consumption of the website, I always tend to consider the folks visiting the website more so than the people managing the websites. I'm not saying that people managing the websites aren't an important use case there, but for the amount of folks and the amount of issues that pop up there, I'm much more concerned with the end users managing the public-facing website versus the back-end work. However, I still think both are super important. However, for a primary audience on a more general web ecosystem in terms of its broader face, I tend to think of the people visiting the websites primarily from what services we can reuse. And that also kind of brings in folks managing the websites. I don't want someone who's, for example, maintaining a static site generator to have to maintain an individual or separately coded theme framework or a central sign-on, for example, when we already have something in WordPress or within Drupal that do the exact same things. And whenever I have to choose between the two, I basically go through a pros and cons of both. Usually it comes down to, really at the end of the day, I feel that my end users are more important. Just because there's a larger number of them, I'm at legal risk if I'm not taking them into consideration versus what the managers of the websites think. When I think about this kind of question, what pops up in my head is accessibility. And at the end of the day, everything that I do, I want to make sure that I incorporate as much of that as possible and make sure that when I build out accessible tools or accessible elements of my website, that I reuse as much of that as possible, so I'm not having, to remediate the work that I'm doing across all my platforms. I hope that helps. We can talk about this more. That's a very large question and a deep rabbit hole, of course, but I think that's a good starting point to trying to provide some emphasis on that. If you have any questions afterwards, we do have the WPCampus Slack, and we have a room, WPC Online, room for questions. I'll be in there afterwards if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to close up shop here and prepare for the next session. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. It's been great to talk with you and talk to you about my experiences at Georgia Tech and in higher education. And I hope that you took something from this and that you're able to bring some expertise and ecosystem knowledge to your institution to help make your work as easy as possible. Thank you very much, and I hope you guys have a great time at the rest of this event.